The morning sun cast long shadows across the Las Vegas Strip, but Robert Martinez felt none of its warmth as he stood outside apartment 4B, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. For the third time that December morning, he pressed his ear against the wooden door, hoping to hear even the faintest sound of life from within. Nothing. Just the same haunting silence that had greeted him for the past hour. Something was terribly wrong. Robert had been renting out his apartment through vacation rental platforms for over 5 years. He'd seen all kinds of guests come and go, young couples celebrating anniversaries, families exploring the entertainment capital of the world, business travelers seeking a home away from home. But never, not once, had guests simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind their belongings and their carefully planned vacation dreams. The couple who had checked in 4 days earlier seemed so ordinary, so full of life and anticipation. Jessica and Mark Thompson from Phoenix, Arizona, had booked the 2-bedroom apartment just 2 blocks from the glittering Strip to celebrate their 3-year anniversary. Their messages had been warm and polite, asking about nearby restaurants and the best walking routes to the famous landmarks. Jessica had even sent a cheerful emoji-filled text about how excited they were for their first trip to Las Vegas together. Now, their silence felt like a heavy blanket of dread settling over Robert's shoulders. He remembered watching them arrive that Friday evening, December 1st, through the building's lobby windows. Jessica, a petite woman with shoulder-length brown hair, had been laughing at something Mark said as they struggled with their matching burgundy suitcases. Mark, tall and lean with an easy smile, had gestured animatedly while describing their weekend plans. They looked like any other couple in love, ready to make memories in a city built on dreams and second chances. But dreams, Robert had learned over the years, could turn into nightmares faster than anyone ever expected. The first sign that something was amiss came on Monday morning when Robert sent his usual checkout reminder message. Guests were supposed to leave by 11 a.m., and he always sent a friendly text around 9 a.m. to remind them about departure procedures. His phone showed that the message had been delivered, but the little read notification never appeared. By noon, when there was still no response, Robert began to worry. He tried calling. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. Jessica's voice sounded bright and cheerful on the recorded greeting. "Hi, you've reached Jessica. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave me a message and I'll get back to you soon." The normalcy of her voice contrasted sharply with the growing pit of anxiety in Robert's stomach. Mark's phone went straight to voicemail without ringing at all. Robert knew the protocols. As a responsible host, he had encountered difficult situations. Before, guests who overstayed their welcome, minor property damage, the occasional noise complaint from neighbors. But this felt different. This felt like stepping into a void where normal explanations simply didn't exist. After sending several more unanswered messages and waiting until well past the checkout time, Robert made the decision to use his master key. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted it into the lock, calling out loudly, "Hello? Mr. and Mrs. Thompson? It's Robert, your host. I'm coming in to check on you." The silence that greeted him was absolute. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would haunt Robert's dreams for months to come. The apartment looked like a stage set frozen in time. Jessica and Mark's suitcases sat exactly where they had left them on the first night, still partially unpacked, with clothes neatly folded inside. 2 smartphones lay side by side on the nightstand next to the perfectly made bed, a bed that looked as though no one had ever slept in it. But it was what covered nearly every surface of the living room that made Robert's breath catch in his throat. Money. Hundreds and hundreds of bills scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves after a storm. They covered the coffee table, spilled from the kitchen counters, and were even tucked between the couch cushions. At first glance, it looked like someone had won the lottery and decided to celebrate by throwing cash around the apartment like confetti. Then Robert looked closer. Each bill bore the same telltale marking. Prop money, stamped in small letters, near the bottom corner. The kind of fake currency used in movies and television shows, designed to look authentic from a distance, but clearly labeled to prevent illegal use. The sight of it sent an ice-cold chill down Robert's spine. Why would a couple celebrating their anniversary need prop money? Why would they leave it scattered throughout his apartment like some bizarre artistic installation? Nothing about the scene made sense. Robert's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Had Jessica and Mark been involved in some kind of film production? Were they actors who had brought their work home with them? But their social media profiles, which he had briefly checked when they first booked the apartment, showed two ordinary people living ordinary lives in Phoenix. Jessica worked as a dental hygienist, and Mark was employed by a local insurance company. Their photos showed hiking trips, dinner dates, and visits with friends and family. Nothing suggested any connection to the entertainment industry. The apartment felt wrong in ways that went beyond the scattered prop money. Personal items were arranged too precisely, as if someone had carefully staged them. Jessica's purse sat open on the kitchen counter, her wallet clearly visible inside, with credit cards and her driver's license still in place. Mark's reading glasses lay folded on the arm of the sofa next to a book he had apparently been reading, a thriller novel bookmarked halfway through. Everything suggested that the couple had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any minute, except they had been gone for days. Robert found himself moving through the apartment like a detective in one of those crime shows he sometimes watched late at night. In the bathroom, two toothbrushes stood in a glass beside the sink. Jessica's makeup bag was unzipped on the counter, lipstick and foundation scattered inside as if she had been getting ready to go out. A damp towel hung from the shower rod, though Robert couldn't tell how long it had been there. The refrigerator contained groceries that Jessica and Mark had obviously purchased for their stay: sandwich meat, bread, bottled water, and a small cake with "Happy Anniversary" written in pink frosting. The cake sat untouched, its cheerful message now feeling like a cruel joke played by fate. But it was in the bedroom that Robert discovered what might have been the most unsettling detail of all. On Jessica's side of the bed, her phone was connected to a charger, its battery at 100%. The last text message on the screen was from someone named Mom, sent Sunday evening. "Hope you two are having a wonderful time. Can't wait to hear all about your trip when you get home. Love you." The message had never been read. Robert stared at that unread text for a long moment, imagining a mother somewhere in Arizona who had no idea that her daughter had disappeared. Into the neon-lit labyrinth of Las Vegas, the weight of that unknown grief, the worry that would soon consume an entire family, pressed down on him like a physical force. He knew he had to call the police. The 911 operator's voice was calm and professional as Robert tried to explain the situation. "How do you describe finding an apartment full of prop money and missing guests without sounding like you're making up an elaborate story? How do you convey the feeling that something terrible has happened when there's no obvious evidence of violence or struggle?" "Sir, is there any sign of forced entry?" the operator asked. "No, nothing like that. The door was locked normally." "Any signs of violence, blood, broken furniture?" "No, everything looks normal except for the money, the fake money everywhere." Robert could hear the slight pause in the operator's voice, the moment when a routine call shifted into something more complex. "Officers will be there within 15 minutes, sir. Please don't touch anything else in the apartment." Those 15 minutes felt like hours. Robert stood in the doorway, afraid to step further into the apartment but unable to look away from the scene before him. The prop money seemed to mock him with its artificial perfection, each bill a reminder that nothing in this situation was what it appeared to be. Somewhere in the back of his mind, He found himself thinking about all the movies he had seen where fake money was used as a plot device, usually in stories about deception, crime, and people who weren't who they claimed to be. But Jessica and Mark had seemed so genuine, so utterly normal. When the police officers finally arrived, Robert felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that professionals would now take over the investigation, and dread that their presence made the situation terrifyingly real. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a case of guests who had lost track of time. This was officially a missing persons case. Detective Sarah Collins was the first to enter the apartment, her experienced eyes taking in every detail with the kind of methodical attention that Robert had only seen in television dramas. She was a woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much of what people could do to each other. "How long since you last heard from them?" she asked, pulling out a small notebook. "Friday evening when they checked in. They sent a text thanking me for the welcome information I provided." Detective Collins nodded, making notes. "And you're certain they were planning to stay through Monday?" "Absolutely. They had paid for 4 nights, and Jessica mentioned in her messages that they wanted to see a show on Sunday night." As more officers arrived and began processing the scene, Robert found himself thinking about all the small details that had seemed unimportant at the time. The way Mark had looked around the lobby with slightly nervous energy when they first arrived, how Jessica had asked twice about the building's security features. The fact that they had specifically requested an apartment away from the strip, saying they preferred somewhere quieter and more private. At the time, these had seemed like the preferences of a couple who wanted to enjoy a romantic getaway, without the chaos of tourist crowds. Now Robert wondered if they had been seeking privacy for entirely different reasons. Detective Collins spent nearly 2 hours in the apartment, photographing everything and carefully collecting samples of the prop money. Each bill was identical to the others, she noted, suggesting they had all come from the same source. The fake currency was high quality, the kind used in professional film productions rather than the cheaper versions available to the general public. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Robert asked as the detective sealed evidence bags. "Not exactly like this, no." Her voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who had learned not to speculate aloud about ongoing investigations. "But money, real or fake, is often used to send messages or create diversions. We'll need to figure out what message this is supposed to convey." As the afternoon wore on, Robert learned more about Jessica and Mark Thompson than he had ever known about any of his previous guests. Detective Collins contacted their emergency contacts, their employers, their families. The picture that emerged was of 2 people living completely ordinary lives in Phoenix, with no known enemies, no financial troubles, and no history of erratic behavior. Jessica's mother, Linda, broke down crying when Detective Collins reached her by phone. Through her sobs, she explained that Jessica and Mark had been planning this trip for months, that they had been so excited about their first vacation together since moving in together the previous year. Mark's parents, contacted at their home in Tucson, were equally bewildered and devastated. "They're good kids," Mark's father told the detective. "Never been in any kind of trouble. Mark's been with the same insurance company for 6 years, and Jessica just got promoted at the dental office. They were talking about getting engaged next year." The weight of these shattered dreams and broken plans hung heavy in the apartment air as the investigation continued. Robert found himself thinking about all the couples he had hosted over the years, all the anniversaries and celebrations and special moments that had played out within these walls. Now those memories felt tainted by the knowledge that sometimes people simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the echo of love that would never find its way home. As evening approached and the police finished their initial investigation, Detective Collins pulled Robert aside for a final conversation. "We're going to need you to keep this apartment sealed for now," she said. "This is an active investigation, and we may need to come back for additional evidence." Robert nodded, though the thought of leaving the apartment exactly as they had found it, with its scattered prop money and frozen-in-time atmosphere, made him feel sick to his stomach. "Do you think—" he began, then stopped, afraid to voice his worst fears. "I think," Detective Collins said carefully, "that Jessica and Mark Thompson got caught up in something much bigger than a romantic weekend in Las Vegas. And I think that whoever scattered this fake money around your apartment wanted us to find it. The question is why?" As Robert locked the apartment door, for what he didn't know would be the last time in months, he could still smell Jessica's perfume lingering in the hallway, a sweet, floral scent that somehow made everything feel even more tragic. Somewhere out there, two families were beginning the worst night of their lives, wondering what had happened to the people they loved most. And somewhere else, perhaps, Jessica and Mark Thompson were discovering that the city of lights and dreams could also be a place where people disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the scattered remnants of a life that had suddenly, inexplicably, come to an end. The neon lights of Las Vegas continued to flash their promises of fortune and excitement into the night sky, but for Robert Martinez, the magic of the city had died in an apartment filled with fake money and real heartbreak. As he drove home through the glittering streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something that would change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who loved Jessica and Mark Thompson. The investigation was just beginning, but already Robert knew that some questions might never find their answers, and some families might never find their peace. The days following, the discovery felt like living in a nightmare that refused to end. Robert found himself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except the image of that untouched anniversary cake and Jessica's unread text message from her mother. He had become an unwilling participant in a story that seemed to grow more mysterious with each passing hour. Detective Collins called him on Wednesday morning with an update that only deepened the puzzle. "We've been going through Jessica and Mark's social media accounts," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been working around the clock. "Everything checks out exactly as it should. They posted normal updates about their jobs, their relationship, their plans for the Vegas trip. Jessica even shared a photo of the dress she bought specifically for their anniversary dinner." Robert closed his eyes, picturing that dress still hanging in his apartment closet, tags still attached, dreams still unfulfilled. What about their families? Have you learned anything new? "That's where things get interesting," Detective Collins continued. "Both families are completely cooperative, completely devastated, and completely convinced that Jessica and Mark would never just disappear voluntarily. But here's what's bothering me. Both of their phones were left behind, but their location history shows completely normal movement patterns right up until Friday evening when they arrived at your building." The implications of this hit Robert like a physical blow. If their phones had been with them the entire time, tracking their movements through Las Vegas, then whatever happened to them had happened after they arrived at the apartment. It had happened in his building, in his space, while he was going about his normal life just a few miles away. "Detective Collins," Robert said slowly, "I need to tell you something that's been bothering me. When I found the apartment on Monday, the bed was perfectly made. Not just neat, it was made with hospital corners, like nobody had ever slept in it. But they checked in on Friday evening. Where did they sleep for 3 nights?" The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough for Robert to wonder if the call had been dropped. Finally, Detective Collins spoke. We noticed that too. We also noticed that despite spending 4 days in Las Vegas, they apparently never left the building after that first night. The grocery receipts we found in the kitchen, trash, are all dated Friday evening, purchased at a store just 6 blocks away. After that, nothing. No restaurant receipts, no show tickets, no casino chips, no evidence of any of the activities they had planned. The picture Detective Collins was painting was of 2 people who had simply stopped living their lives the moment they entered Robert's building. But if they hadn't left and they weren't in the apartment, where had they been? "There's something else," the detective added, and Robert could hear papers rustling in the background. "We ran the serial numbers on the prop money. Every single bill came from the same batch, manufactured by a company in California that supplies major movie studios. But here's the thing, that particular batch was reported stolen 6 months ago from a warehouse in Los Angeles." Robert felt his stomach drop. Stolen prop money scattered throughout his apartment by 2 people who had vanished without a trace. Each new piece of information made the puzzle more complex, more frightening, and more impossible to understand. "Do you think Jessica and Mark stole the money?" "Honestly, I don't know what to think. Their backgrounds don't suggest any involvement in theft or fraud, but someone wanted us to find that money, and they wanted us to find it connected to Jessica and Mark's disappearance." That afternoon, Robert received a call that he had been dreading. Linda Thompson, Jessica's mother, had driven from Phoenix to Las Vegas and wanted to see the apartment where her daughter had last been seen. Detective Collins had cleared it with the investigation team, and Robert couldn't bring himself to refuse a grieving mother's request. Linda was a small woman in her early 60s, with the same warm brown eyes as her daughter. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, touching nothing but absorbing everything with the desperate intensity of someone searching for answers in a place where none existed. "She was so excited about this trip," Linda whispered, as she stood in the bedroom doorway, staring at Jessica's untouched suitcase. "She called me 3 times the week before they left, asking for advice about what to pack, what to wear. She wanted everything to be perfect." Robert watched helplessly as Linda picked up Jessica's phone from the nightstand, her hands shaking as she read the unread text message she had sent 3 days earlier. "I keep calling her," Linda said, tears streaming down her face. "I know she's not going to answer, but I keep calling anyway. I can't stop myself. It's like if I just keep trying, eventually she'll pick up and tell me this is all some terrible mistake." The raw pain in Linda's voice was almost unbearable. Robert found himself thinking about his own daughter, living safely in Portland with her husband and 2 children. He couldn't imagine the agony of not knowing where she was, of not knowing if she was safe, of not knowing if he would ever see her again. "Mrs. Thompson," Robert said gently, "I promise you that I'm doing everything I can to help the police figure out what happened. Jessica and Mark seemed like wonderful people, and they didn't deserve whatever happened to them." Linda looked up at him with eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and desperation. "Do you really think they're still alive?" It was the question Robert had been asking himself for days, and he still didn't have an answer. In his heart, he wanted to believe that Jessica and Mark had somehow gotten caught up in a misunderstanding that would eventually be resolved, that they would walk back into his apartment with a reasonable explanation for everything. But his mind kept returning to that scattered prop money, to the untouched bed, to the feeling that the apartment had been deliberately staged for someone to find. "I think," Robert said carefully, "that Jessica and Mark were in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and got caught up in something they didn't understand. But I also think that the police are good at their jobs, and they're going to figure out what happened." It was a small comfort, but it was all he could offer. That evening, Detective Collins called with news that sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. "We found the delivery person from the security footage," she said without preamble. Or rather, we found that there was no delivery person. The food delivery badge was fake, purchased online using a prepaid credit card. But the interesting thing is what the building's security cameras captured. Robert had almost forgotten about the security cameras. In the chaos of the past few days, he hadn't even thought to ask what they might have recorded. What did they show? "Your guests arrived at 6 p.m. on Friday, just like you said. They were carrying grocery bags and looked completely normal. But at 10:15 that same night, someone entered the building using a fake delivery badge. The person was wearing a hooded sweatshirt and kept their face turned away from the cameras, but they knew exactly where they were going." Detective Collins paused, and Robert could hear her flipping through papers. "This person went straight to your floor, stayed for exactly 11 minutes, and then left using the emergency stairwell, which doesn't have camera coverage. We never see Jessica and Mark leave the building, but we also never see them again after Friday night." The implications were staggering. Someone had come to the building specifically to find Jessica and Mark. Someone who knew which apartment they were, staying in, and how to access the building without being properly identified. This wasn't a random crime or a case of mistaken identity. This was planned. "Detective Collins, how would someone know that Jessica and Mark were staying in my apartment? The booking was made through the rental platform, but that information isn't public." That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. Either someone had access to booking information that should have been private, or Jessica and Mark told someone where they were staying. Given what we know about their personalities and their plans for a quiet romantic weekend, the second option seems unlikely. Robert spent that night staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of a hooded figure moving through his building with purposeful determination. Someone had targeted Jessica and Mark specifically, had known exactly where to find them, and had somehow made them disappear without leaving any evidence of violence or struggle. The next morning brought another devastating revelation. Detective Collins called early, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Robert, I need to ask you about the rental booking platform. How long ago was Jessica and Mark's reservation made?" "Let me check." Robert pulled up his host account on his laptop, scrolling through his booking history. It looks like the reservation was made on November 15th, about 2.5 weeks before their arrival. They booked it through a newly created account. That's what I was afraid of. We've been working with the platform's security team, and they've discovered that the account used to book your apartment was created specifically for this reservation. The payment was made with a prepaid card purchased with cash. No real credit card, no verifiable identity. The room seemed to spin around Robert as the full implications hit him. "You're saying that Jessica and Mark didn't book the apartment themselves?" "I'm saying that someone else booked it and somehow convinced Jessica and Mark to show up. We're looking into whether they received fake confirmation emails, fake itineraries, anything that might have led them to believe they had booked the trip themselves." This revelation changed everything. Jessica and Mark hadn't disappeared from a vacation they had planned. They had been lured to Las Vegas under false pretenses, drawn into a trap that had been carefully set weeks in advance. But why? Robert asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "That's the million-dollar question," Detective Collins replied grimly, "but I think we're about to find out." Later that day, Robert received a call from Mark's father, David Thompson, who had driven up from Tucson to join the search efforts. "Mr. Martinez," David's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and grief, "I need to tell you something that might be important. We found something in Mark's apartment back in Phoenix." Robert felt his heart start to race. "What kind of something?" "Hidden in Mark's desk drawer, we found a letter. It's postmarked from Las Vegas, dated 2 weeks before their trip, but Mark never mentioned receiving any mail from Vegas, and the return address doesn't exist. The letter, David explained, contained what appeared to be a job offer from a fictional company, inviting Mark to interview for a position that would triple his current salary. The interview was scheduled for the exact weekend that he and Jessica had supposedly planned their anniversary trip. The thing is, David continued, his voice breaking, Mark never mentioned this job opportunity to anyone. Not to Jessica, not to his co-workers, not to us. But we found the letter with notes in his handwriting like he was seriously considering it. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening click. Someone had been manipulating both, Jessica and Mark, feeding them different stories to get them to the same place at the same time. Jessica thought they were going on a romantic anniversary trip. Mark thought he was going to a job interview that could change their lives. Neither of them realized they were walking into a carefully constructed trap. "Mr. Thompson," Robert said slowly, "did the letter mention anything about accommodation? Arrangements?" "It said the company would provide lodging for the interview weekend. It gave the address of your building." Robert felt physically ill. The elaborate deception was worse than anything he had imagined. Jessica and Mark had been systematically manipulated, lied to, and ultimately betrayed by someone who had studied their lives carefully enough to know exactly which buttons to push. That evening, as Robert sat in his own apartment trying to process everything he had learned, his phone rang with a call from an unknown number, Mr. Martinez. The voice was female, older, with a slight accent he couldn't identify. "My name is Catherine Walsh. I work at the Golden Palace Casino, and I think I might have information about your missing guests." Robert's heart stopped. "What kind of information?" "I saw Mark Thompson at the casino 3 weeks ago. He was with a man I didn't recognize, someone who seemed to know a lot about high-stakes gambling. They were talking about something that made Mark very nervous, very upset. I only remember because Mark seemed so out of place in that environment." The world tilted on its axis as Robert realized that there were still secrets buried beneath the surface of this case, still revelations waiting to destroy whatever remained of his understanding of what had happened to Jessica and Mark. "Mrs. Walsh," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think you need to call Detective Collins immediately." As he hung up the phone, Robert stared out his window at the Las Vegas skyline, its neon promises now seeming sinister rather than exciting. Somewhere in this city of illusion and deception, the truth about Jessica and Mark Thompson was waiting to be discovered. But with each new revelation, Robert was beginning to fear that the truth might be more terrible than anything they had yet imagined. The fake money scattered throughout his apartment was beginning to feel like a warning, a message from people who dealt in deception and manipulation as easily as others dealt in truth and honesty. And if those people were capable of making Jessica and Mark disappear without a trace, what else might they be capable of? Robert double-checked the locks on his own apartment door and tried not to think about hooded figures moving through buildings in the dark, carrying fake delivery badges and real intentions that no one could yet understand. Catherine Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 70s who had worked at the Golden Palace Casino for nearly 15 years. When Detective Collins and Robert met with her the following afternoon, her story added a disturbing new dimension to the mystery surrounding Jessica and Mark's disappearance. "I remember him clearly because he looked so uncomfortable," Catherine explained, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Most people who come to the high-stakes tables have a certain confidence about them, you know. But this young man, Mark, he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world." Detective Collins leaned forward, her notebook ready. Can you describe the man he was with? Older, maybe in his 50s, with silver hair and an expensive suit. He spoke with an accent, Eastern European, maybe Russian or Polish. But what struck me most was how he seemed to know Mark, like they had history together. He called him by name, asked about his girlfriend. Robert felt his blood turn to ice. Someone with knowledge of Mark's personal life had drawn him into the casino world weeks before the couple's fateful trip to Las Vegas. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was another piece of an elaborate plan that had been months in the making. "Did you hear any of their conversation?" Detective Collins asked. Catherine nodded slowly, her eyes distant with the effort of remembering. The foreign man was talking about opportunities, about how Mark was wasting his potential working for an insurance company. He mentioned numbers, big numbers, said something about how easy it would be for someone in Mark's position to access certain types of information. The detective's pen stopped moving. What kind of information? Insurance records, claims databases. He said there were people who would pay handsomely for the right kind of data, especially information about high-value policies and claims. Robert felt sick. The picture Catherine was painting was of Mark being recruited for some kind of insurance fraud scheme, targeted because of his access to confidential information through his job. But according to everyone who knew him, Mark was scrupulously honest, the kind of person who wouldn't even take office supplies home from work. How did Mark react to these suggestions? Detective Collins continued. He got angry, Catherine said firmly, told the man he wasn't interested in anything illegal, said he loved his job and would never do anything to compromise his integrity. The foreign man laughed and said something, like everyone has a price, Mark. Sometimes they just don't know what it is yet. Detective Collins and Robert exchanged glances. The conversation Catherine was describing sounded like a recruitment attempt that had failed, but it also suggested that whoever was behind Mark's disappearance hadn't given up after that first meeting. "Mrs. Walsh," Robert said gently, "did you see them together again after that night?" "No, but..." Catherine hesitated, as if deciding whether to share something else. "About a week later, I saw the foreign man again. He was talking to some people I recognized as being involved in underground gambling operations, high stakes, games that aren't exactly legal, if you know what I mean." Detective Collins looked up sharply. "Are you saying this man was connected to illegal gambling?" "I'm saying that in my 15 years at the casino, you learn to recognize certain types of people. This man had the look of someone who operated outside the normal rules. And the people he was talking to that night, let's just say they weren't discussing the weather." As they left the casino, Robert's mind was reeling with the implications of what they had learned. Someone had targeted Mark specifically because of his job, had tried to recruit him for illegal activities, and when that failed, had apparently decided to use him for something else entirely. But what did any of this have to do with Jessica? She worked as a dental hygienist, with no access to valuable databases or confidential information. Why would she have been drawn into this scheme? The answer came sooner than Robert expected, in the form of a phone call from Linda Thompson that evening. "Robert." Linda's voice was shaky, with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I found something in Jessica's bedroom that I think might be important." "What is it?" "A business card, hidden in her jewelry box. It's for a company called Desert Rose Consulting, and it has a Las Vegas address. But when I tried to call the number, it's been disconnected." Robert immediately called Detective Collins, who agreed to meet them at the Thompson family home in Phoenix the next morning. The drive through the Arizona desert gave Robert too much time to think, too much time to imagine all the terrible possibilities that might explain why two innocent people had been drawn into something so dark and complex. Jessica's childhood bedroom was a shrine to a life that had been brutally interrupted. Her parents had left everything exactly as it was, unable to face the finality of packing away her belongings. The business card Linda had found was tucked behind a small jewelry case, hidden carefully enough that it might never have been discovered. If not for a mother's desperate search for clues, Detective Collins examined the card carefully. Desert Rose Consulting was printed in elegant script, with a Las Vegas address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. The phone number had indeed been disconnected, but not until 3 days after Jessica and Mark's disappearance. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Collins said gently, "did Jessica ever mention this company or anyone associated with it?" Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Never. Jessica told me everything about her work, her friends, her plans with Mark. She would never have hidden something like this unless she was scared," Robert finished quietly. The investigation into Desert Rose Consulting revealed that it was a shell company created 6 months earlier and dissolved the week after. Jessica and Mark disappeared. The company had no employees, no real business operations, and no legitimate purpose that investigators could identify. But buried in the financial records they eventually obtained, Detective Collins found something that changed everything. Desert Rose Consulting had paid for Jessica and Mark's supposed anniversary trip. The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. Not only had someone else booked the apartment using a fake account, but the same shell company that had tried to recruit Mark for illegal activities had also been manipulating Jessica. The entire trip, the romantic weekend Jessica thought Mark had planned, the job interview Mark thought he was attending, had been funded by people with their own agenda. They were being set up from the beginning, Detective Collins said as she shared this information with Robert over the phone. Someone studied their lives, figured out their weaknesses and desires, and created a scenario that would get them both to Las Vegas at the same time. But why go to such elaborate lengths? If these people wanted to hurt Jessica and Mark, there had to be easier ways. "That's what's been bothering me too," the detective admitted. "All of this planning, all of this expense and complexity, it suggests that Jessica and Mark weren't random victims. They were specifically chosen for something, and whatever that something was, it required them to be in Las Vegas voluntarily." The answer to that puzzle came in the form of another missing persons report, filed just 2 days after Robert discovered the empty apartment. Detective Collins called him with the news on a grey Saturday morning that felt heavy with unspoken dread. "Robert, we found another case with remarkable similarities to Jessica and Mark's disappearance. An apartment 3 miles from yours, rented through the same vacation platform, paid for with a prepaid card by a newly created account." Robert's heart started pounding. Another couple? 2 graduate students from Denver. They were supposedly in Las Vegas for an academic conference that never existed. When the property owner checked on them after they failed to respond to messages, she found the apartment empty except for their personal belongings and hundreds of pieces of prop money scattered throughout the rooms. The parallel was too exact to be coincidental. Someone was using the same methodology, the same deception tactics to lure people to Las Vegas and make them disappear. But why? What was the purpose of this elaborate operation? "Detective Collins," Robert said slowly, "how many other cases like this might there be? How many other people might have disappeared the same way?" "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. We're reviewing missing persons reports from the past year, looking for similar patterns. But Robert, there's something else you need to know." The detective's voice carried a weight that made Robert's stomach clench with anxiety. "The prop money from the second apartment came from the same stolen batch as the money found in your apartment." We're dealing with the same people, the same operation, and based on the pattern we're seeing, I don't think they're finished. That night, Robert lay awake thinking about Jessica and Mark, about the graduate students from Denver, about families across the country who might be wondering why their loved ones had stopped answering their phones. The scale of what they were dealing with was becoming clear, and it was more frightening than anything he had imagined. Someone was systematically targeting people with specific qualifications. Mark, with his access to insurance databases, the graduate students with their research expertise, and presumably Jessica with skills or knowledge that made her valuable to this unknown organization. They were being lured to Las Vegas under false pretenses, and then they were simply vanishing. But vanishing to where? And for what purpose? The answer would come from an unexpected source in the form of a phone call that would shatter what remained of Robert's faith in the possibility of a happy ending to this story. Detective Collins called him at 2 a.m., her voice tight with exhaustion and something that sounded like fear. "Robert, we found them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Robert didn't want to understand. Jessica and Mark, and the graduate students from Denver, and 3 other people we didn't even know were missing. Robert's world tilted on its axis. They're alive," Detective Collins said quickly, but her tone suggested that this wasn't necessarily good news. "They're in a private medical facility about 50 miles outside Las Vegas. But Robert, this isn't a rescue situation. This is something much worse than we ever imagined." As Detective Collins explained what they had discovered, Robert realized that the scattered prop money, the elaborate deceptions, the carefully planned disappearances, all of it had been leading to something that existed in the Shadowlands, between legal and illegal, between healing and harm. Jessica and Mark hadn't been kidnapped in any traditional sense. They had been recruited against their will and without their knowledge into a medical research program that operated outside the boundaries of law, ethics, and human decency. The prop money had been a signature, a calling card left by people who dealt in the currency of human lives rather than paper bills. And somewhere in the desert outside Las Vegas, in a facility that didn't officially exist, Jessica and Mark were learning that the line between victim and test subject could disappear as easily as 2 people stepping out for an anniversary dinner and never coming home. As Robert hung up the phone and stared out at the Las Vegas skyline, he realized that the most terrifying truth of all was that this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The medical facility sat like a mirage in the Nevada desert, surrounded by chain-link fencing and surveillance cameras that tracked every movement within a 2-mile radius. From the outside, it looked like any other corporate research campus. Clean white buildings, manicured landscaping, and signs indicating it was a private biotechnology research center. But as Detective Collins would later explain to Robert, sometimes the most terrible secrets were hidden behind the most ordinary facades. The raid had been planned for weeks after investigators discovered the facility's connection to the missing persons cases. What they found inside would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. They called it voluntary participation in groundbreaking medical research, Detective Collins said, her voice hollow with exhaustion as she briefed Robert on what they had discovered. But none of the participants had actually volunteered. They had all been deceived, manipulated, and brought there under false pretenses. Robert sat in the detective's office, surrounded by boxes of evidence and photographs he couldn't bear to look at. 2 weeks had passed since the raid, and he was still struggling to understand how such a thing could exist in the modern world. "How many people?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 17 that we found. Jessica and Mark, the graduate students from Denver, and 13 others from across the country. All of them had been reported missing by their families, but the reports had been filed in different jurisdictions, so no one saw the pattern until we started looking. The pattern, Detective Collins explained, was both simple and horrifying. The organization behind the facility had been identifying people with specific skills, knowledge, or physical characteristics that made them valuable for medical experimentation. They had studied their targets carefully, learning about their relationships, their dreams, their vulnerabilities. Then they had created elaborate scenarios to lure these people to Las Vegas, where they disappeared into a system that treated human beings as laboratory equipment. Mark was targeted because of his access to insurance databases, Detective Collins continued. They needed someone who could help them identify potential test subjects based on medical records and genetic information. Jessica was taken because she was a dental hygienist with knowledge of oral surgery techniques they needed for their research. Robert felt sick. The woman who had been so excited about her anniversary trip, who had asked her mother for advice about what? Dupac had been selected as a test subject because of her professional skills. What kind of research were they doing? Detective Collins was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Experimental procedures that no legitimate medical institution would ever approve. They were testing drugs and surgical techniques that were decades away from being safe for human trials. The participants were kept sedated most of the time, unaware of what was being done to them. The room felt like it was spinning around Robert, but they're alive, all of them? Physically, yes, but Robert... Detective Collins stopped, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. The psychological trauma is severe. Most of them have no clear memory of the past several months. They know they went to Las Vegas for what they thought were legitimate reasons, and then everything becomes a blur of medical procedures and drug-induced unconsciousness. Robert thought about Linda Thompson, waiting in Phoenix for news about her daughter. How do you tell a mother that her child is alive but forever changed by experiences too horrible to fully remember? What about the people running the facility? Gone. By the time we raided the place, the main operators had vanished. We found some low-level employees who are cooperating with the investigation, but the people at the top of this organization had exit strategies in place. They've probably been planning their escape routes since the day they started this operation. Detective Collins pulled out a file from one of the evidence boxes and placed it on the desk between them. There is one thing I want you to see, though. We found this in what we believe was the main office of the facility. The file contained photographs and detailed profiles of potential targets, people who had been identified for future recruitment into the illegal research program. Robert's blood turned to ice as he realized what he was looking at. Dozens of innocent people who had no idea they were being stalked by an organization that viewed them as experimental subjects rather than human beings. How many more facilities like this might exist? Robert asked. We don't know. This operation had connections to similar research programs in other countries, places where ethical oversight is even more limited than it is here. We think this Las Vegas facility was just one node in a much larger network. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Detective Collins' office door. A younger officer entered, his face grim with the weight of bad news. Detective, we just received word from the hospital. Mark Thompson is asking to speak with Robert Martinez. The drive to the medical center where the survivors were being treated felt like the longest journey of Robert's life. He had been dreading this moment since learning that Jessica and Mark had been found alive How do you face someone whose life has been destroyed because they trusted a rental listing you posted online? Mark was sitting by a window in the psychiatric ward, staring out at the Las Vegas skyline that had once held such promise for his future with Jessica. He looked decades older than his 28 years, his eyes hollow with experiences that no amount of therapy would ever fully heal. "Mr. Martinez," Mark said without turning away from the window, "thank you for coming." Robert sat down carefully, unsure of what to say or how to begin a conversation that felt impossibly difficult. "Mark, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you and Jessica have been through." "That's just it," Mark said, finally turning to face him. "We can't imagine it either. The doctors say that's probably a blessing, that our minds are protecting us from memories that would be too traumatic to process. But not knowing is almost worse than knowing, you know?" Robert nodded, though he couldn't really understand. He had nightmares about what might have happened to Jessica and Mark, but at least his nightmares were just imagination. For Mark, the nightmares were fragments of real experiences that his mind refused to let him fully remember. "I do remember some things," Mark continued. "I remember that job interview letter and how excited I was about the opportunity. I remember thinking that if I got the position, Jessica and I could get married sooner than we had planned. I remember arriving at your apartment and feeling like everything was finally falling into place." Mark's voice broke and Robert had to fight back his own tears. "I remember Jessica being so happy. She kept talking about how proud she was of me for pursuing this opportunity, how much she loved that we were starting this new chapter of our lives together in Las Vegas. She had no idea that I thought I was there for a job interview. She thought I had planned a romantic anniversary surprise." The cruel complexity of the deception was heartbreaking. Two people who loved each other had been manipulated into believing completely different stories about their trip, each trying to make the other happy, while walking into a trap that had been set by people who viewed their love as nothing more than a tool for manipulation. "Mr. Martinez," Mark said quietly, "I need you to know that none of this was your fault. The people who did this to us, they would have found another way, if not for your apartment. You were just unlucky enough to get caught up in their plan." Robert had been carrying the weight of guilt for weeks, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he could have prevented what happened. Mark's forgiveness was a gift he didn't feel he deserved. "How is Jessica?" Robert asked. Mark's face darkened. "She's struggling. The doctors think she may have been subjected to more intensive procedures because of her medical background. She wakes up screaming sometimes, but she can't remember what she's screaming about. She knows something terrible happened to her, but her mind won't let her access the memories." The thought of Jessica, who had been so excited about her anniversary trip, now trapped in a cycle of terror and confusion, was almost unbearable. "Will she recover?" Robert asked. "The doctors don't know. They say trauma affects everyone differently, and what was done to us, there aren't really any comparable cases to study. We're all guinea pigs again, just in a different kind of experiment." Mark turned back to the window, and for several minutes they sat in silence, watching the Las Vegas Strip come alive with its nightly display of lights and promise. "You know what the worst part is?" Mark finally said. "I keep thinking about all the other people who might be going through this right now. The facility we were in, it was just one building in a complex of buildings. When they raided it, they found evidence of other locations, other operations." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. "Other locations? The people running this thing, they're still out there. And they're probably already setting up new facilities, identifying new targets, creating new elaborate schemes to kidnap people without anyone realizing they've been kidnapped." The implications were staggering. Somewhere, other families might be dealing with loved ones who had simply vanished while on seemingly innocent trips. Other couples might be walking into traps disguised as romantic getaways or business opportunities. "Mark," Robert said slowly, "is there anything you remember that might help the police find these other operations?" Mark was quiet for a long time, his face creased with the effort of trying to access memories that his mind had locked away for his own protection. "There was a man," he said finally. "Someone I remember from before everything gets blurry. He had an accent, Eastern European maybe. He talked about how what they were doing was revolutionary, how they were advancing medical science by decades." Robert's heart started racing. This man, did he have silver hair, expensive suits? Mark looked at him sharply. "You know who I'm talking about?" Catherine Walsh at the Golden Palace Casino described someone just like that, someone who tried to recruit you weeks before your trip to Las Vegas. "Then he's still out there," Mark said grimly. "And if he's still out there, then this isn't over." As Robert left the hospital that evening, he carried with him the weight of Mark's words. The case that had begun with fake money scattered in a vacation rental apartment was part of something much larger, much more sophisticated, and much more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. Detective Collins called him as he was driving home. "Robert, we've identified the man with the silver hair. His name is Viktor Kozlov, and he's wanted by international law enforcement agencies for his involvement in illegal medical research operations across 3 continents. He's been doing this for years, perfecting his methods, staying one step ahead of authorities. Where is he now? Unknown. But Robert, there's something else. We found evidence that he's been monitoring news coverage of the Las Vegas case. He knows we're onto him, and he knows that Mark and Jessica and the others can potentially identify him." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken, but understood. Viktor Kozlov and his organization had invested too much time and money in their operation to simply walk away. They would want to eliminate any evidence that could lead back to them. Are Mark and Jessica safe? For now, they're under police protection at the hospital. But Robert, I think you should consider taking some precautions yourself. Your apartment was part of their operation, and you've been central to the investigation. If they decide that loose ends need to be tied up, Robert didn't need her to finish the sentence. He understood that by helping to uncover this conspiracy, he had made himself a target of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy innocent lives to protect their secrets. That night, as Robert sat in his apartment checking and rechecking the locks on his doors and windows, he thought about Jessica and Mark lying in hospital beds, trying to piece together fragments of memories that might never fully return. He thought about families across the country who might still be wondering why their loved ones had stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped coming home. And he thought about Viktor Kozlov, somewhere in the world, already planning his next operation, already identifying new targets, already crafting new elaborate deceptions to trap people whose only crime was trusting in the possibility of love, opportunity, and hope. The scattered prop money had been more than just a calling card. It had been a promise. A promise that in a world where everything could be faked, where identities could be manufactured and lives could be bought and sold, the only currency that truly mattered was human suffering. But as Robert looked out at the Las Vegas skyline, its neon lights reflecting off his windows like tears on a face that had seen too much, he made a promise of his own. He would not let Jessica and Mark's story end in a hospital room filled with broken memories. He would not let Viktor Kozlov disappear into the shadows to continue his horrible work. Tomorrow he would call Detective Collins and volunteer to help with the ongoing investigation. Tomorrow he would reach out to other vacation rental hosts to warn them about the signs to watch for. Tomorrow he would begin the long process of turning his anger and guilt into something that might prevent other families from experiencing the nightmare that had consumed the Thompsons. Because in a city built on the promise that anyone could win, Robert had learned that the most important victories were often measured not in money gained, but in lives saved and families kept whole. The investigation would continue. Victor Kozlov would eventually be found, and Jessica and Mark Thompson would slowly, carefully begin the long journey back to something that might someday resemble the life they had planned together. The prop money was gone, collected as evidence and locked away in police storage. But the real currency of this story, love, hope, resilience, and the determination to protect others from harm, would continue to accumulate interest in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by the courage of two people who had survived. The unthinkable. In Las Vegas, where fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a card, Jessica and Mark had discovered that the greatest wealth was simply being alive, being together, and being free to heal from wounds that would always be part of their story, but would never define their ending. If this story has moved you, if you've felt the fear and hope alongside Jessica and Mark, if you've found yourself thinking about the people in your own life who matter most to you, then you understand the power of human connection in the face of unimaginable darkness. These stories matter because they remind us that behind every headline, every missing person report, every unsolved case, there are real people with real dreams that deserve to be protected. Hit that subscribe button if you want to continue following stories that dive deep into the human heart, even when it's breaking. Like this video, if Jessica and Mark's journey touched something inside you. And please share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply acknowledge that these stories are real, that these people matter, and that we're all connected by the threads of hope and vulnerability that make us human. Thank you for walking through this darkness with me. Thank you for caring about people you've never met. And thank you for believing that, even in our most broken world, love still has the power to light the way home.